My name is John Matthews, and even though almost 30 years have passed since it all happened, I still feel the weight of that time on my shoulders. Back then, I was a police officer in a small town in rural Oregon called Crestwood. I loved my job and believed I knew every corner of that peaceful community. But in 1995, everything changed. It all started with the disappearance of a young girl named Emily Johnson. She was the daughter of a well-known couple in town, and the last time she was seen, she was walking to school. She never made it. The whole town went into a panic. It wasn't common for someone to go missing in Crestwood, especially not someone as promising as Emily. Days went by, and the search efforts intensified. My partner, Tom Baker, and I went door to door, questioning residents, searching the forests and rivers. But it was like Emily had vanished into thin air. I felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders, as if the entire town was counting on me to find answers. But there were no clues. Just the oppressive silence that settled over Crestwood. Weeks passed, and in the midst of our desperation, other disappearances began to occur. First, it was a 10-year-old boy named Samuel Green. Then, an elderly woman, Marjorie Thompson. The town was on the brink of collapse. The media started covering the events, and Crestwood was no longer the quiet, peaceful town it used to be. People started locking their doors earlier, no one went out alone. It was like fear had taken root in every corner, in every face. The tension was palpable. I could see the fear in every citizen's eyes, and I couldn't blame them. I was terrified too. Then, during one of our endless searches, Tom and I found an old cabin, forgotten in the woods surrounding the town. It was partially covered in ivy and moss, as if nature itself was trying to hide it. Inside, the air was heavy, and a sharp smell of mold and something else, something rotten, permeated everything. We explored the place carefully, and that's when we found the first signs that something much more sinister was happening. There were strange symbols carved into the walls, things I'd never seen before. On the floor, there were marks that looked like melted candles, and in the center, a circle of stones with remnants of something that had been burned. What we saw made us realize we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. This wasn't just a simple missing persons case. There was something deeper, more evil, behind it all. As we left the cabin, a cold wind swept through the forest, and I felt like we were being watched. But there was no one there. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. Tom and I decided to come back the next morning with reinforcements. But before we could leave, the cabin door slammed shut with a bang, locking us inside. We tried everything to get out, but it was like something was holding us there, like the cabin itself had a will of its own. Desperate, we headed down to the basement, hoping to find another way out. But when we got down there, we realized we'd walked into a trap. The basement was even more disturbing. The walls were damp, and there were more symbols carved into them, along with bones scattered on the floor. The air was thick, almost unbreathable. We felt like something or someone was down there with us, an invisible presence hovering around us. Time seemed to stop, and the desperation began to take hold of us. I don't know how, but in a moment of sheer luck or desperation, we managed to force open an old window that led us outside. We ran away from that cabin, not looking back. When we finally got back to town, we didn't say a word about what we'd really seen. We only reported that we found an abandoned cabin with no significant evidence. But the truth was, we knew there was something much bigger at play. Something we couldn't understand, let alone confront. After that day, the disappearances stopped, and Crestwood slowly began to return to normal. But I never could. The images of that basement, those symbols, and the feeling that something was watching us never left me. Tom moved away shortly after, saying he needed a fresh start far from that place. I stayed, but not because I wanted to. I felt like I needed to be there, like that cabin was calling me back, like something was unfinished. Every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I still feel that presence. It's as if the cabin, or whatever was inside it, never really let me go. I spent years trying to find rational explanations for what we saw, but I never could. I don't know what that cabin was, or who performed those rituals, but I know that something ancient and evil was buried in that forest. And even now, so many years later, I feel like the evil we encountered never really left us. Some say I'm paranoid, that the trauma of those events twisted my mind. Maybe they're right. But I know what I saw, what I felt. And deep down, I think everyone in Crestwood knows too. The evil may have quieted down, may have disappeared from the surface, but it's still there, waiting. And someday, I fear it will come back, stronger, hungrier. And when it does, I hope someone is prepared to face it. Because I know I won't be. I had no idea what awaited me in the small town of Crestwood, in rural Oregon, when I was assigned there. Fresh out of the academy, my badge still shiny, and the confidence of someone who believes they can change the world, I had no clue what I was about to encounter. My first big assignment seemed simple: investigate the disappearance of a woman at the old Holloway farm, a property many in town avoided, but that I, in my inexperience and determination, saw as just another place to work. The farm had been abandoned for decades, ever since the last member of the Holloway family died under mysterious circumstances, they said. Locals spoke of the place as if it were cursed, but I didn't pay much attention to those superstitions. When I first arrived, I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I chalked it up to the cold wind blowing through the trees. The main house was in ruins, but it wasn't where I focused my attention. It was a cabin in the woods, hidden by vegetation, that caught my eye. As I walked along the narrow path leading to the cabin, an eerie silence fell over everything around me. Not even the birds sang, and each of my steps seemed to echo unnaturally. When I finally spotted the cabin, I was surprised by its condition. It looked like someone still lived there, which contradicted everything I'd heard about the place. I approached cautiously, my hand on my holster, ready for anything. Inside the cabin, the stench of rot was overwhelming. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted with something I chose not to investigate too closely. The air inside felt suffocating, as if it were contaminated by something evil. I heard a noise coming from one of the rooms and braced myself for the worst. When I opened the door, I found a woman tied up and visibly traumatized. She looked at me with wide eyes but didn't make a sound. Before I could free her, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I turned just in time to see a man, visibly disturbed, coming toward me with a knife in his hand. He was mumbling incomprehensible words, as if in a trance. There was no choice, I had to act quickly. In a matter of seconds, the confrontation unfolded, and I managed to disarm and handcuff him. His blank stare and the absence of any attempt at explanation left me uneasy. It was as if he wasn't really there, as if he were just a puppet for something much more sinister. We managed to rescue the woman and get her to the hospital, but her condition was severe. Besides the physical injuries, she seemed mentally broken, as if something had drained all her will to live. She could barely speak, and when she did, she mentioned things that made my skin crawl: rituals, sacrifices, and a cult she claimed controlled the town. At first, I thought it was all delirium, a result of the trauma she had suffered. However, the more I investigated, the more I discovered that something was deeply wrong in that town. The man who had held the woman captive wasn't a stranger. He was a respected member of the community, someone everyone knew and trusted. And he wasn't alone. There were signs that other residents were involved in something much bigger and more disturbing than I could have imagined. I started to feel like every step I took was being watched, that every word I said was being heard. The town, which had once seemed welcoming, now revealed itself as a dark place, where every face hid a secret. People began treating me differently, as if they knew I was getting close to the truth. I tried to take the case to higher authorities, but I was met with bureaucracy and disdain. It seemed like no one wanted to mess with what was happening there. I was alone, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. One night, I woke up with the feeling that someone was in my room. The darkness was total, and the silence deafening. My instincts as a cop made me grab my gun, but when I turned on the light, there was no one there. However, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. From that moment on, my sleep became a battlefield. Nightmares haunted me every night, and I woke up in a cold sweat, unsure of what was real and what was a product of my imagination. I began to question my sanity. The clues I found, the things I heard, everything pointed to something beyond my comprehension. It was as if the town was impregnated with a malevolent force, something that couldn't be explained with logic or reason. And that force was trying to destroy me, to make me give up. But I couldn't stop, not after what I saw in that cabin, not after seeing what that woman had suffered. I decided that the only way to uncover the truth was to go all the way, even if it meant facing the demons that seemed to haunt that town. More and more, I felt like I was being pushed toward an abyss, but at the same time, something told me I was close to understanding what was really going on. I needed to know. Even if it cost me my life, I needed to understand what was hidden in the shadows of that small town. That night, I returned to the cabin. I knew it was madness, but I felt that there I would find the answers I had been searching for. When I arrived, the cabin was different. The door was open, and a faint light was coming from inside. I entered cautiously, and what I saw left me paralyzed. In the center of the room was a circle of candles, and in the middle of it, an old book with a worn leather cover. I felt a presence in the air, something telling me to run, but I couldn't move. I flipped through the book, and with each page, it felt like a part of me was being torn away. The words written there made no sense, but at the same time, they seemed to have a power over me. Suddenly, I heard a soft voice, almost a whisper, calling my name. It was the voice of the woman I had rescued, but when I turned, there was no one there. Fear took hold of me completely, and before I could react, everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, I was outside the cabin, still holding the book. I didn't know how I had gotten out or how long I had been unconscious. Everything around me seemed distorted, as if reality had bent over itself. I ran back to town, but nothing felt normal anymore. The streets were deserted, the houses empty. I was alone in a place I no longer recognized. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened that night. All I know is that something changed inside me. The town, the farm, the cabin. All of it seemed part of a nightmare I would never escape. I requested a transfer and eventually left the police force. But the memories of that place still haunt me to this day. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that I'm back in that cabin, with that voice whispering my name. I wonder if I'll ever be able to forget. But deep down, I know there are things that can't be forgotten. And the old Holloway farm is one of them. It was a cold, rainy night in Portland, Oregon, when my partner, Steve, and I got a call about a domestic disturbance in a rough part of town. Apparently, neighbors had been hearing screaming and sounds of things breaking for hours. It wasn't the first time we'd responded to a call like this, but something about it made us uneasy. Maybe it was the desperate tone of the woman who called or the strange feeling of foreboding that settled over us as we approached the address. When we arrived at the house, the sense of discomfort only grew. The house was an old building, with peeling paint and windows covered in dust. The front yard was littered with trash and old objects, giving the place an air of abandonment. Steve knocked on the door while I got ready, keeping my hand close to my holster. When the door finally opened, the first sign that something was wrong was the smell. A strong, acrid odor that I immediately recognized as drugs, but there was something else, a stench of decay that made me shiver. We were greeted by a pale, nervous woman, her eyes wide and her hands trembling. She could barely form a coherent sentence but led us inside to the living room. The place was a complete mess. Furniture overturned, shards of glass scattered on the floor, and the smell. The smell was getting worse. In a corner of the room, a man was sitting on a torn-up sofa, seeming completely unaware of what was going on around him. His eyes were glazed over, and his breathing was heavy. Steve approached the man, trying to talk to him, while I took a closer look around the house. That's when I noticed a door slightly ajar, leading to the basement. A dark instinct told me something horrible was hidden down there. I called Steve, who followed me silently, and together we started down the creaking steps. With each step, the smell of decomposition grew stronger, almost unbearable. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, the scene we found haunts me to this day. On the floor, wrapped in black plastic, was the body of a woman. She was in an advanced state of decomposition, and the air in the basement was thick with the stench of death. Steve held his breath as I approached to check for any signs of life, though I knew it was pointless. That woman had been dead for days, maybe weeks. We quickly went back upstairs and arrested the man and woman we found in the house. They didn't resist, as if they knew there was nothing more to be done. As we cuffed them, the woman began to mutter something about a debt, but her words were confused, as if she were in shock or under the influence of drugs. It didn't take long for the situation to get even tenser. As we were leading the two outside, a third person emerged from the shadows. He was armed with a knife, his eyes fixed on Steve with an expression of pure rage. Everything happened so fast. Before I could react, the man lunged at Steve, who barely had time to defend himself. But Steve was an excellent officer, and his response was quick and precise. In one motion, he drew his weapon and fired, hitting the attacker squarely. The man's body hit the ground with a dull thud, and the silence that followed was terrifying. The sound of the rain outside seemed distant, almost non-existent. Steve was shaking as he looked at the fallen body, the weight of the situation finally settling in. The woman we'd arrested started screaming, and the man, who had been apathetic, was now sobbing quietly, as if finally realizing the gravity of what had happened. On the way to the station, the man confessed to the crime. He said the woman in the basement was his accomplice, but things got out of control when they couldn't pay a drug debt. He killed her in a fit of rage, desperate because of the threats he was receiving from the dealers. The story he told was grim, but it wasn't the confession that left me uneasy, it was the look in his eyes, as if he knew his fate had been sealed long before we were called to that house. The trial was swift, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But for me, that case never ended. I revisited that house many times in my thoughts, reliving every detail, every smell, every sound. I remember how the rain fell heavily that night, how the air seemed loaded with something more than just moisture. And I remember Steve, his face pale and his hands shaking, still holding the gun that saved his life. After the incident, Steve decided to leave the force. He said he couldn't continue, that night had taken something from him that he could never get back. I stayed, but with a constant weight on my shoulders, as if I were carrying a fragment of that house with me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see the basement, smell the odor, and hear the woman's screams as she realized her life was ruined. There are things in a police officer's life that mark us forever. This case was one of those things. I learned that true darkness isn't just in the terrible acts people commit, but in the secrets they hide and the monsters they create within themselves. Crestwood was never the same for me, and that house will forever be a symbol of the horror that resides in the human heart. It was the fall of 1987, in a small town in rural Maine, when I was assigned to a case that, at first glance, seemed like any other, the disappearance of a teenage girl named Katie Harrison. I, Daniel Reeves, a veteran and naturally skeptical police officer, thought I'd seen it all in my career, or so I believed. But what I found in that forest completely changed my perspective on the world. Katie was 16 years old and disappeared on a Friday afternoon while walking home from school. Her parents, desperate, contacted the police as soon as they realized she hadn't come home. The initial searches revealed nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of a struggle, no clues as to where she might have gone. It was as if she had evaporated. The town went into panic mode, and the authorities intensified the search, but everything pointed to Katie being taken somewhere beyond our understanding. After 3 days without any leads, a local resident reported seeing strange lights in the Whispering Pines forest, an area known for its legends of supernatural events. I didn't believe in any of that, ghosts, rituals, mystical creatures. To me, they were just stories told to scare kids. But with no other leads to follow, we decided to investigate the area. With a small team, we headed into the forest, unaware of what awaited us. The walk to the spot where the lights were seen was quiet, disturbingly quiet. There was no sound of birds, no rustling of leaves. The air was heavy, filled with a sense that something was wrong. When we finally reached a clearing, we found evidence suggesting that someone, or something, had performed a ritual there. There were marks on the ground, symbols I didn't recognize, and most unsettling of all, the air seemed to vibrate, as if nature itself was tense. In the center of the clearing, there was a door. But it wasn't an ordinary door. It was standing upright in the ground, with no walls, no structure around it. Just an old wooden door, with intricate carvings and a wrought iron handle. It looked out of place, as if it had been ripped from another reality and planted there. My instinct told me to run, but the mission was to find Katie, and this was the only lead we had. We opened the door cautiously, and to our surprise, it led to an underground tunnel, carved into the rock. We descended slowly, our flashlights illuminating the narrow, damp path. The air inside was dense, almost suffocating, and the sound of our footsteps echoed disturbingly. With each step we took, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if we were being followed by invisible eyes, keenly observing our every move. After walking down a long corridor, we arrived at a large chamber, dimly lit by a faint, greenish light that seemed to emanate from the walls. And that's where we found her. Katie was lying on the ground, unconscious but alive. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were murmuring something incomprehensible. As I approached to help her, I felt a shiver run down my spine. We weren't alone. In the darkest corner of the chamber, something moved. It was a tall, slender figure with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The Watcher, that was the name that came to mind, as if the creature itself had planted the thought in my head. Its presence was overwhelming, a mix of terror and fascination. It stared at us, without making any movement, but the threat it posed was clear. We couldn't stay there. With tremendous effort, I lifted Katie and began to leave the chamber, with my partner, Mike, covering our retreat. The Watcher didn't follow us, but I felt its eyes on our backs, as if it were amused by our escape. When we emerged back into the clearing, the door slammed shut behind us with a bang, disappearing the moment I looked back. The clearing was empty, and silence reigned once more. We managed to get Katie back to town, where she was immediately hospitalized. She was in shock, unable to speak, only murmuring disjointed words about shadows, eyes, and something that watched her in the dark. The doctors couldn't explain what had happened to her, and I knew that even if I tried, no one would believe our story. Who would believe in a mysterious door in the middle of the forest leading to a nightmarish creature? Time passed, but that night never left me. Katie eventually recovered physically, but mentally, she was never the same. Nightmares haunted her, and she avoided any mention of the forest. Mike and I decided not to talk about what we saw, not even with each other. It was easier to try to forget, to pretend it was all just a poorly explained nightmare. But I knew the truth, the Watcher was still there, in the darkness of the forest, waiting for its next victim. After that incident, I requested a transfer and moved south, trying to leave everything behind. But memories are hard to erase, and at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like something is watching me. I became obsessed with understanding what that creature really was, trying to find some rational explanation for what we experienced that night. But the more I researched, the more lost I felt. Whispering Pines became a place I avoided even in thought. The town was never the same after Katie's disappearance. Some people talked about strange lights in the forest, but I knew the truth. The real darkness wasn't in the lights, but in what lurked in the shadows. What scares me the most is knowing we weren't the only ones to encounter the Watcher. And that, somehow, it always finds a way to come back. Looking back now, I realize that case changed everything. I, who had always been skeptical, who never believed in anything beyond what I could see or touch, now carry with me a fear I can't explain. The Whispering Pines Forest is a place where reality and imagination blur, where legends come to life. And the Watcher. It's proof that there are things in this world that go beyond our understanding. Things that should remain in the shadows. It was one of those nights when the cold wind cut like knives, and the deserted roads seemed to stretch infinitely under the darkness of the Montana sky. I was in the middle of my patrol shift, driving down a little-traveled highway, known for being isolated and rarely used at night. The trees stood tall and menacing along the roadside, and the sound of the tires on the asphalt was the only noise breaking the silence. Everything was calm, until something unexpected happened. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated a figure running along the shoulder, heading toward the dense forest that lined the road. The person, dressed in dark clothes, seemed terrified, as if they were fleeing from something. Instinctively, I stopped the car and got out, calling out to the person, but they didn't even look back. They disappeared among the trees in the blink of an eye. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, and a sense of impending danger took hold of me. I knew it was risky to follow someone into the dark forest, but something about the way that person ran, the desperation in their flight, compelled me to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured into the forest, trying to follow the trail of the unknown person. The dense trees and thorny bushes made my passage difficult, and the feeling of being watched grew with every step. It didn't take long for me to realize I wasn't alone. The sound of breaking branches around me made me stop. I swung the flashlight around, but all I saw were shadows. My heart began to race when I realized I was surrounded. Emerging from the shadows were masked figures, one by one, until I could count at least 10 people around me. Some held axes, others were armed with knives. All of them wore expressionless white masks that reflected the light of my flashlight in a sinister way. I turned slowly, trying to stay calm. My breathing was heavy, and adrenaline began to pump through my veins. They didn't say anything, didn't make any aggressive moves, but the silence was more threatening than any words. One of the masked figures, slightly taller than the others, stepped forward. In his hand, an axe gleamed in the moonlight, and his presence seemed to radiate a dark authority. "Leave," he said, his voice muffled by the mask but firm and undeniably dangerous. "You shouldn't be here. Go back to where you came from and forget what you saw." His words were more of a command than a warning, and the tone of threat was unmistakable. For a moment, I thought about confronting them, trying to arrest the group, but logic hit me like a punch in the gut. I was at a great disadvantage, alone in the middle of the forest, surrounded by people clearly willing to use violence. I nodded slowly, backing away one step at a time, never taking my eyes off them. Every movement I made was closely followed by the masked figures, as if they were ready to attack at the slightest sign of resistance. When I finally turned and started walking back to the road, my whole body was trembling. I could feel their eyes piercing my back, and the sense that I was one step away from death followed me with every meter. As soon as I left the forest and got back to my car, I felt a wave of relief mixed with dread. I started the engine and sped away from there, not looking back. The road seemed darker, and the silence, once comforting, now felt full of secrets. My mind was a jumble of thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. Who were those people? What were they doing there, armed and masked, in the middle of a deserted forest? When I got to the station, I reported the incident to the sergeant on duty. He listened carefully, but the expression on his face told me he found the story hard to believe. Indeed, there wasn't much to go on without more information. No apparent victims, no concrete crimes, just a scared cop with an experience that, to anyone else, would seem like a hallucination. But I knew it was real as the fear I still felt. In the days that followed, I tried to investigate more about what might be going on in that forest, but every lead seemed to end in a dead end. I discreetly asked the locals, but no one knew anything, or at least, they didn't want to talk about it. It was as if a wall of silence surrounded that place, and any attempt to break through it resulted in suspicious looks and evasive answers. The incident was never officially investigated, and it ended up becoming one of those stories cops tell each other during night shifts, like a horror tale to pass the time. But for me, it wasn't just a story. The idea that there was a secret society operating there, in the late 20th century, in a remote part of the country, left me uneasy. And what scared me the most was the feeling that, if I hadn't been identified as a cop, I might not be here to tell this story. Even today, every time I patrol that road, I stay alert for any sign of movement in the forest. I never saw anything strange again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, in the darkness, I feel like I'm being watched again, that those masked eyes are still following me, waiting for me to make the mistake of getting too close. And then, I'm filled with the certainty that there are dark secrets hidden in the shadows of our society, ready to emerge when we least expect it. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't obeyed. If I had confronted those masked figures, or if I had called for backup. Would I have been able to expose that secret society? Or would I have just dug my own grave? These questions remain unanswered, and maybe it's better that way. Sometimes, it's safer to leave mysteries hidden in the darkness where they belong. It was a cold December night in Detroit when my partner, Mike, and I got a call that seemed routine. A burglar alarm had gone off in an office building downtown. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so we thought. The building, an old hospital converted into offices, had been the target of false alarms before. But that night, something felt different, even if I couldn't quite put my finger on it. When we arrived, the building was engulfed in oppressive darkness. Only one light flickered outside, casting an unsettling, intermittent glow over the entrance. The wind howled through the deserted streets, bringing with it a cold that seemed to cut to the bone. Mike and I exchanged a quick look before getting out of the patrol car, and he joked that he hoped it wasn't a rat setting off the alarm again. Little did we know what awaited us inside. The main door was locked, as you'd expect after hours. We rang the intercom, and soon a hoarse voice responded, informing us that the caretaker was on his way to let us in. An elderly man, wearing a worn coat and thick-rimmed glasses, opened the door for us. He introduced himself as Mr. Harold Mitchell and led us inside, explaining that he had retired years ago but still lived in the building and occasionally helped take care of the place. As soon as we entered, we felt a shift in the atmosphere. The white walls and wide corridors, which should have felt welcoming, now had an air of desolation, as if time inside was trapped in an endless cycle of abandonment. As Mr. Mitchell led us through the halls, we noticed something strange. The doors to the offices he claimed were locked were slightly ajar. He frowned, saying it must be a mistake, but something in his tone made me suspicious. We continued on, checking each room, locking the doors we found open. I was trying to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Mike, who was usually the more relaxed of the two of us, also seemed uneasy. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls, and a low, almost imperceptible hum reverberated in the air. After checking the last floor, we decided it was time to leave. Everything seemed to be in order, and we were beginning to think it was just a faulty alarm. When we reached the ground floor, something bizarre happened. The main doors, which had been open, slammed shut with a deafening bang. I ran to try and open them, but it was as if they were locked from the inside. The force with which they had closed was terrifying, and adrenaline started to kick in. Our radios, silent until then, began to emit a loud and disturbing static. It was impossible to communicate with the station or even with each other. Mike looked at me, his face pale, and I knew he was as scared as I was. We were trapped inside, without communication, and the presence of Mr. Mitchell, who had disappeared without a trace, made everything even more surreal. We tried reopening the doors, but it was useless. We decided to go back and try to find another exit, or at least figure out what was going on. As we walked through the corridors, the lights kept flickering, and the sense that something was very wrong intensified. Suddenly, I noticed that the doors we had locked earlier were open again. Every single one of them. Mike and I exchanged a panicked look. There was no way this was just a coincidence. Someone, or something, was messing with us. We went back to the upper floor, where we had last seen Mr. Mitchell, but he was nowhere to be found. Instead, we found one of the rooms lit up, the only one in the entire building. A faint light escaped through the cracks in the door. Mike approached it hesitantly and pushed the door open slowly. The inside was empty, except for an old desk and chair. On the desk was a single framed photograph. When I got closer to take a look, a chill ran down my spine. The photo was of Mr. Mitchell, much younger, wearing an elegant suit. Beside him was a smiling woman, presumably his wife. But what caught my attention was the date written in the bottom corner, 1978. That didn't make sense. The Mr. Mitchell we'd seen was an elderly man, but the man in the photo looked no older than 40. And then something occurred to me. I remembered a story that circulated among the veteran officers about a former administrator of the hospital who had mysteriously disappeared back then. My heart started racing as I turned to Mike, who was pale and trembling. We didn't need to say anything to each other, we both knew what it meant. The man who led us into the building wasn't the caretaker, he was someone who, if the stories were true, shouldn't be around anymore. The building suddenly felt much more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the sense of being trapped became unbearable. We tried, in desperation, to find another way out, but every door we tried was locked or led back to the same corridor. Fear began to turn into panic, and I realized we were in a maze of doors and corridors that no longer made sense. Finally, after what felt like hours, we heard a loud click and the main door opened on its own, slamming against the wall. Without hesitation, we ran outside, leaving the building and all that madness behind. It was only when we were a safe distance away, inside the patrol car, that the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Our radios returned to normal, and communication with the station was restored, but neither of us could explain what had occurred inside. Days later, I decided to research the building, and to my surprise, I found an old article about Mr. Harold Mitchell. He had been a renowned administrator who worked at that hospital for years until, after his wife's death, he mysteriously disappeared. Since then, there had been rumors that his presence still haunted the place, especially at night, as if he were searching for something or someone. After that incident, I never went back to that building. The memories of that night remain vivid in my mind, a constant reminder that there are things in this world that defy our understanding. What happened to Mike and me that night remains a mystery, something I prefer not to revisit. There are places where the past refuses to die, where lost souls wander, trapped in an eternal cycle of searching and despair. And the old hospital-turned-office building is one of those places, a place where the shadows of the past still walk among the living. I had been on the police force for over 2 decades when I was called to investigate the disappearance of Laura Shepard. For me, missing persons cases were nothing new. But something about this one made me uneasy from the start. Laura was 34, a primary school teacher, well known and loved by everyone in the small town of Ashford, in northern Washington. She disappeared from her own home on a regular Thursday night, leaving no trace. The house was in perfect order, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished. When I arrived at Laura's house, I was met by her parents, who were visibly shaken. They told me that Laura had been getting ready for bed when they heard a strange noise coming from outside. When they went to check, she was already gone. The doors were locked from the inside, and all the windows were closed. Something was clearly wrong, but there was no logical explanation for what could have happened. As I examined the house, something caught my attention. On the floor of Laura's bedroom, near the window, there was a strange mark, almost imperceptible, as if something had been drawn there and then erased. It looked like an ancient symbol, but it was too worn to identify clearly. I felt a shiver when I realized that mark didn't seem to have been made by Laura. And if it was, what did it mean? As the investigation progressed, I discovered that Laura had recently become involved in researching local history, specifically ancient rituals practiced in the Ashford Forest. The town had a long tradition of legends about mysterious activities in the forest, and these stories had been passed down from generation to generation. Some people believed that something dark resided in the depths of the forest, and Laura seemed to have taken more interest in these stories than usual. I started following this lead, talking to the town's oldest residents. Most refused to talk about the forest, only shaking their heads and muttering that some secrets were better left buried. However, one man, Henry Lawson, told me about a group of people who, many years ago, conducted rituals in that forest, trying to summon something ancient and powerful. He warned me not to go there, saying that anyone who got involved with it ended up paying a terrible price. Even with Henry's warning echoing in my mind, I knew I couldn't give up. Laura was somewhere, and I needed to find her. So, on a cold autumn morning, I decided to go into the Ashford forest. The mist hung heavily over the trees, and the sunlight barely penetrated the dense foliage. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into a living nightmare. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of my own footsteps and breathing. After walking for over an hour, I found a clearing where the air seemed to vibrate with a strange energy. In the center, there were stones arranged in a circle, and in the middle of them, a rudimentary altar, covered in moss and ancient marks. It was as if the place was frozen in time, a remnant of something that shouldn't exist. And then, I saw her. Laura was lying next to the altar, her eyes open but unfocused. She was alive, but in a state of pure shock. There was something in her gaze that made me realize that even though I had found her, something inside her was lost forever. I carried her back through the forest, trying to comfort her as she muttered incoherent things. Words about shadows, eyes in the darkness, and a name she repeated incessantly, a name I had never heard before. When we finally reached town, she was taken to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't explain her condition. Laura no longer spoke, only whispered that name over and over. Even after rescuing her, something told me the case was far from over. I continued to feel the presence of that forest, as if something inside it was calling to me, daring me to return. The marks I saw on the floor of Laura's house now seemed to make sense. They were part of something bigger, something that was still active, something that hadn't been defeated. But what disturbed me most was the thought that if I kept investigating, I might be opening a door that should remain closed. Laura was never the same again. Her parents, desperate, decided to take her far from Ashford, hoping that time and distance would help her recover. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever was in the forest wasn't limited by distance or time. It had left a mark on her, a mark I feared would be permanent. And maybe, in some way, it had left a mark on me too. I couldn't get the story out of my head. I returned to that forest several times, always feeling the same oppressive presence, but never finding anything concrete again. The local legends began to haunt me, Henry Lawson's words echoing in my mind with every step. I felt I was on the verge of discovering something terrible, something that would change my worldview forever, but at the same time, I knew I had no choice but to keep investigating. The town of Ashford continued its daily life, but there was a shadow over it, something everyone noticed but no one dared to mention. People began to avoid the forest more than ever, and Laura Shepherd's name became a whisper of fear among the residents. Some said she had been touched by something evil, others believed the forest had claimed her soul. But the truth was much more complicated, and I was the only one who knew how deep it went. I committed myself to finding out what really happened to Laura in that forest, to understanding the connection between the ancient rituals and whatever was lurking in the shadows. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, I began to realize that maybe this wasn't a mystery that could be solved. Maybe, instead of fighting against what we don't understand, it was better to learn to live with the fear, to accept that there are things in this world we simply can't explain. I'm still in Ashford, and the forest is still there, silent and imposing, like a guardian of secrets that shouldn't be revealed. Sometimes, when the wind blows the right way, I can hear the whispers among the trees, as if the forest is alive, watching, waiting. And as long as I'm here, I'll continue my vigil too, knowing that the evil lurking in those trees was never really defeated, just dormant, waiting for the next opportunity to manifest. This is Laura Shepherd's story, and it's also mine. A story of an encounter with the inexplicable, with forces that defy logic and reason. I don't know how it will all end, but I know I can't give up. Because in the end, I'm not just investigating Laura's disappearance, I'm trying to understand the very nature of the evil that lives among us, hidden in the shadows of the Ashford forest. And that, my friend, is something I will never stop doing. If you like this true horror story, you can't miss 6 disturbing true high school horror stories, the scariest story you've ever heard. Watch the video, click on the video appearing here in the card, or search for the previous video on this channel. And, of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience too. Stay brave and see you in the next scary story.